Hi everybody. What you're about to watch is an interview that I've just come off with Laurence Juber, former Wings guitarist from that last iteration of Wings that recorded Back to the Egg and did the subsequent concerts of that era. So this was a group call. There were several of us. We were promised an hour with Laurence. In the end, he was very generous. He actually gave us over 2 hours of his time. Nothing was off limits, and there's some really interesting stuff in here, for example, relating to the Japan drugs bust. Interesting stuff. Now, I realise this is a really long video. This is uncut. Now, there's going to be edited versions on the channels of James Griffiths and Ross Goodall, who were both also on the call. So I'm going to put some links to their channel if you want to keep an eye on theirs, if you want to watch out for an edited version. But this is uncut. I occasionally manage to get in a word in edgeways and ask one or two questions, but here goes. Hope you enjoy.
Morning, Laurence.
Good morning.
It's my enormous pleasure to introduce double Grammy winner, composer, arranger, guitar virtuoso, and one of the few musicians to play with 3 out of the 4 Beatles, plus a who's who of rock nobility. Welcome, live from LA, Laurence Juber.
Hello.
Hi, Laurence.
Hi, Laurence.
Hi, Laurence. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
I just one slight caveat. My roofers showed up this morning and they promised they're not going to be bashing. But if you hear the occasional blast of mariachi music, then that's not coming from my studio. It's coming from above.
As long as the beat is in time, we don't mind.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So thanks for taking time, because I know you've got a very hectic schedule coming up, lots of touring, solo gigs with Airfoil, etc. And I think you've got a lecture coming up as well. We're all massive fans of Back to the Egg and that whole period of Wings in '79 and onwards. It was the second Wings album I ever bought, and one of my favorites, and much beloved by everyone here on the call. What we struggle to understand with, why did it get that sort of critical backlash at the time it was released? Because we thought it was fantastic. What's your theories, Laurence?
I think that's critics for you. You know, and also, I mean, the timing at that point was, you know, you coming out of this kind of period where you had Rumors, Saturday Night Fever, albums that were selling in the tens of millions, with, you know, multiple hit singles. And of course, Paul stalwartly refused to put the singles on the albums, you know, which goes back to the Beatles era. And so Goodnight Tonight, which was a big hit all over Europe and in the States, wasn't on the album. And I think that would have kind of given it a little bit of a kind of a boost to begin with. This still doesn't account for the fact that the critics just didn't, you know, they were always expecting another Abbey Road. And, you know, at some point, you know, they just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we're not going to get one of those. But, you know, in the course of time, of course, the critics have reevaluated it. And it went from, I think Rolling Stone had it as a 2-star, and then it became a 4-star. So I think that's just the nature of things. You know, some of the coolest records don't necessarily get immediate recognition.
Do you think Paul will go back and reevaluate it himself?
That's a tricky one, because I think that period, because this was kind of like Wings' swan song, you know, and my perception is that Linda was kind of just getting tired. You know, she's now got 4 kids, has done the world tour thing, and I think that she was getting tired. Paul was turning 40 and was going off in a different musical direction, and you can hear that, you know, with the post Back to the Egg stuff. I mean, beyond McCartney II, which, you know, was in and of itself kind of critically kind of like the critics weren't quite sure what to make of that one either. But again, that's been reevaluated in the course of time and has become kind of an iconic record for DJs, because it was really like very early experimentation with electronica. you know, even though Paul was doing it, you know, still in a very analog fashion, it just was a bit of a groundbreaking record there. I think that it was just, and when I joined the band, I knew that there had never been more than like a 2-3 year incarnation of Wings. So I knew that there was going to be kind of an end point anyway. But you know, from my perception, when we started on that record, Paul said, you know, you have to think of yourselves as a band. And while he wasn't doling out songwriting assignments like he did, you know, with one or other of the previous albums, nonetheless, we approached it very much as we're not just Paul's backing group, but we're actually kind of thinking as a band, which worked nicely, I think, for the duration of the record. And the record came out as a Wings album, not as a Paul McCartney and Wings album. But, you know, beyond that, I mean, we didn't really have much control over the overall circumstances. The fact that it was reaching an end of a particular, I mean, the 70s were coming to an end. You know, Paul's immediate post-Beatles incarnation in Wings was clearly, you know, about to fold, or at least as it became evident. But in the space that we did the record, I think that there was a lot of very band-like sensibility going on, and I think that that's reflected in the way in which the record turned out. There were some questions. For example, Chris Thomas, who co-produced the record, you know, and he did that in between the Sex Pistols and the Pretenders. I mean, it was, you know, Chris was kind of like the hot producer at the time. But he didn't get to use his own engineer. So Phil McDonald engineered the record, which was coming really from a more traditional kind of from the Beatles perspective in terms of sonically. I think that if Chris had his own way, the record might have had a bit more of a kind of a little more American sounding as opposed to British sounding. But that's not necessarily a bad thing that it sounded British, you know.
And if we can take you back to the sort of first time that you stepped into a recording studio with Paul, Linda and Denny, I think it was May 78, Rack Studios in St. John's Wood. I think that was the first session, according to the research I've done anyway.
First session was same time next year.
Same time next year, that's right. So recording that. How did you feel when you walked in the room, and how did that whole initial session go? Because I guess it's a critical period.
Well, we didn't do it at Abbey Road. We did it at Rack, R-A-K. And subsequently used the Rack Mobile for the Scotland and Lim Castle sessions. So, you know, and I was used to walking into Abbey Road. I mean, I'd worked at Studio 2. In fact, when I got the call to go audition for Wings, I was working in Studio 2. It was very unusual to get a phone call, you know, in those days, pre-cell phones. You know, you didn't get calls at the studio unless something, you know, kind of major was going on. And I had never been upstairs into the control room because the musicians were always kind of like down in, you know, in the main room. And unless you were on the production team, you didn't go up. But I had to go upstairs to take a phone call. And, you know, so I got to see, you know, walk through the control room and see the console with the quadrant faders, you know, so the faders on the console, on those EMI consoles had kind of like a curve to them as opposed to being a straight throw. And just as a side note, the other day I was in a studio here in LA, a new studio that actually has that console. It's the same recording console that Dark Side of the Moon was recorded on. So there's kind of a little studioology there, as it were. But going into Rack, I mean, it was like another session. But except it was with Paul and Linda and Denny, and Steve Holley was, you know, it was his first session too. And I think, if I recall, we recorded that song fairly quickly. I mean, it only took maybe, you know, 3-4 takes to do. And then they subsequently overdubbed a string orchestra. The sad thing was, I mean, it was a great song, and a very classic kind of McCartney kind of movie-like ballad, but he didn't get it into the movie. Marvin Hamlish, who I'd previously worked with on The Spy Who Loved Me, was the one who ended up scoring the picture. And then the song they used was one that he'd written with Carol Bayer Sager, who was his significant other at the time.
And I think same time next year, Never Actually Saw release until 1990 as a B-side, which is a great shame.
It was a little earlier. I think it wasn't 88. It was a bonus track on the Put It There single.
Right.
Yeah. And that had been remixed a couple of times. We did a remix of it on the very last session that we did in January of 81. And then I think it got remixed again before it was released. But there wasn't a lot to change about it because it was a fairly simple kind of piano, electric guitar, bass, drums, and strings kind of track.
And I think it was another month before you went up to Root Studios in Scotland and spent a whole month laying down a whole series of tracks there.
No, not quite. We went up to Scotland at the end of May, where we rehearsed for a few weeks. We didn't do any recording, but we did shoot the video for I've Had Enough. Even though Steve and I weren't on the record, that was done right around the end of May, and it was a single camera shoot. So every scene had to be set up with, just for the one camera. So there were different camera angles that were set up. So it was like an all-night thing. But which was fun because that was the first time we actually got to perform as Wings, even though we hadn't actually played on the record. Subsequent to that, we went to New York and met with Lee Eastman, Linda's dad, and started talking about just the business of being, getting integrated into the band. And we went back up to Scotland for the month of July, was when we started recording for Back to the Egg, seriously.
And you must have got really close, obviously, all living in the same space at that time.
Oh, yeah.
How quickly did the band start to gel as a five-piece?
Well, immediately, because there was, Steve and I both brought our own musical experience to it, and just, we were doing, in that first go around in May, we were doing a lot of jamming. There was one point we were jamming on, I think Steve was playing keyboards, and I think Linda was playing drums. It was either Paul or Linda was playing drums, but Steve was playing this chord progression. No, Paul was playing guitar and Linda was playing drums. And Steve played this chord progression that ended up being the instrumental section of Old Siamsa. So, in modern kind of songwriting rules, Steve would have actually got songwriting credit for that. But in those days, if you came up with arranging ideas, you didn't, that just didn't work that way, especially when Paul McCartney's the boss, But there's an example of us kind of working together to create the arrangement. But, pretty much, there were some demos of the songs, but when we actually started recording seriously, we were just kind of making the songs work the way that they needed to work. And because of the personalities involved and the musicality involved, it just came out sounding like a band. And having a producer like Chris Thomas, who was very meticulous about guitar sounds, for example. So, I'd be playing and he'd come over and he'd tweak my amplifier behind my back and stuff like that. But, that's all cool stuff. I do the same thing when I'm producing people. So.
Well, we hope that one day we get to hear some of those demos on maybe an archive edition of Back to the Egg.
Yeah, it's funny because I know there was a cassette with various demos on, but I never got a copy of that. So I don't know what even exists anymore. They could have been traded by some EMI engineer for a bunch of Elvis stuff or something. That's how a lot of those bootlegs get out, is there's German engineers with like Elvis TV shows, or whatever, and then they trade for Beatles or Wings or whatever, or Springsteen. It's this kind of subculture.
So, Laurence, how would Paul McCartney typically present a song to you before that first band demo?
He would play it. You know, play it on guitar or piano or whatever. And that's, you know, typically the way it gets done is you just present the song and talk it through and then, you know, start playing it down. The first one we recorded was To You, which was a very different song from Same Time Next Year. It was a very different musical direction. And so with that one, Paul was playing acoustic guitar and, you know, just played the song down. And then we started recording it, you know, and you just do it. You know, better to get the job started, you know, and once you know kind of where you're going with it. And that was not that complicated. But you learn the chords and you know, the drummer will get the groove and away you go.
Laurence, you were saying that that To You was a very different kind of song to the other material. Was there a sense going?
Certainly very different from Same Time Next Year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, did you get a sense going into the album that McCartney had got this plan to do, because it's almost two albums in one, isn't it? You've got the sort of the rocky stuff, and there's this other side of the record, which is the sort of, you know, the ballads and the soft things. Was that a conscious decision? Did you get the sense that it's almost like a concept album, isn't it? But
kind of a concept album without a concept.
Yeah.
I think part of the conceptualization of it, you know, because Chris Thomas, you know, brought kind of a conceptual thing, you know, having worked with kind of the art rock, you know, like Pink Floyd and Procol Harum and stuff, where you can kind of, and the fact is, I mean, you know, a Beatles album was rockers and ballads too. I mean, it's just part of kind of Paul's general kind of operating principle. But certainly when we started, I mean, we did To You, we did Spin It On, we did Old Siam Sir. Those were the first batch. But then we did, when we were in Scotland in that first go round, we also did Love Awake, Winter Rose, and Arrow Through Me.
I think you did Cage as well in that whole period. Is that correct?
Cage we started it in Scotland, but we did more work on it when we got to Lim Castle. So, you know, we'd started the process in July, and then took August off, and then went back we went into Lim Castle for all of September.
And Cage was originally intended to be on the album, I think, so it got bumped quite late on for Baby's Request. What was the sort of thing?
Baby's Request we did at Abbey Road. That was one, during the break, Paul and Linda were in the south of France on vacation, and they saw the Mills Brothers, you know, kind of old, you know, 30s style vocal group. And Paul decided he was going to write a song for them. So he wrote Baby's Request, and then we recorded it when we were at Abbey Road in October. And that was, if I recall, Denny played piano on that, and then Paul played bass, I played guitar. And then the funny thing with that one was that, you know, there was room for a solo, and Paul, you know, we were talking about like a trombone solo. And I said, well, you know, in Studio One, Don Lasher, who's probably the greatest trombone player in the world, is recording right now. Do you want to bring him in? And he said, no, I'll do it myself. And Paul did it on a Minimo, you know, with this kind of faux trombone sound. But that's Paul, you know, very much the self-sufficient one.
Laurence, I'm pretty sure that you were the most musically educated person that Paul had ever had in his band, certainly at that point. I don't know about since. Did you feel that you were allowed more input as a result of that? Because I know, for example, Henry McCulloch, one of his big beefs in Wings was that he didn't feel he had much input to be able to do his own thing. Do you think you were able to because of your education in music?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I was asked to join the band was because I was versatile. that I could play a lot of different styles. And I learned that from, because I had first worked with Denny on a David Essex TV show where Denny was a guest and we did Go Now. And I didn't know for many years that shortly after that, Denny had called the musical director to find out if I was versatile, because they wanted a guitar player to replace Jimmy McCulloch, who wasn't just a rock guitar player. You know, and both of my predecessors, fantastic guitar players, not necessarily with the same kind of rounded musicianship that I brought to it. And I've always been a bit of a chameleon in terms of I can change my colors depending on the context that I'm working in.
Yeah.
So for me, the joy of working with Paul really was more important to me than how often I got to play a lead guitar solo. Because the fact is that Paul has never been a big fan of extended solos. I mean, in more recent years, he's kind of, allowed more of that. But in those days, I mean, you got your 8 bars at the most. Yeah. And so I could understand Henry's frustration with that. Even though, I mean, you look at Henry's solo on My Love, where there's just this concentrated emotion that is just for the ages, because it's just such a perfect solo. But I didn't feel constrained because I was allowed a lot of my own input. The first solo I recorded was for To You, when I was in the studio. Paul and Chris Thomas were in the control room, and Paul was manipulating an eventide harmonizer in real time while I was playing. So any note that I would play, I would hear a different note in the headphones. So I was just going completely outside of the box in what I was doing. And Paul, so it was like a kind of an intuitive process, a very improv kind of process. And, that's a very different thing from just laying down kind of a balls to the wall solo type thing. Yeah. With Spin It On, when I overdubbed the solo sections on that, I was sitting in the control room next to Paul and just eyeball to eyeball, and, just Paul bringing stuff out of me that I didn't know I could do. So it was very much, and that kind of synergy was really, and that's something as a studio musician has always been a great motivator for me, is the synergy of working with great musicians and how the combination can kind of lead to something that is different from, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
That's a very fast and frenetic solo on Spin It On. It's fantastic. Was that played in real time? It sounds almost like it's sped up.
No, it was real time. We didn't speed up the tape or anything. That would have been that would have been a pain to do that. No, it was just, I was, as a teenager and beyond, I was, I became a big fan of like fusion. I mean, the stuff that I was listening to, I wasn't listening to Wings in the 70s. I was listening to like Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever, kind of fusion bands, and listening to stuff that was really kind of pushing me to explore what I could do improvisationally without necessarily being confined to, normal song structure, because on the kind of the commercial side of things, I never got to do more than 4 or 8 bars in a guitar solo on a record, And so to try and kind of take that background and then integrate it into this Wings space, it was a wonderful opportunity.
Did Paul have much?
Sorry, can I just pick up on one thing you just said? So,
sure.
Laurence, I think it's fair to say that probably everyone on the Beatles Zoom worships Paul McCartney. You've just said that playing eyeball to eyeball with him, it brought out something in you that only great people bring out. But what were your underlying feelings about Paul McCartney as a person and as a musician?
Well, I mean, it was very easy to get along with him and Linda. It was very, it's very open. And of course I was kind of a junior partner there because, they're 10 years older than me. But I found Linda very easy to get along with. very encouraging. And Paul, you know, is this kind of like, has this burning nucleus of creativity, and you can't help but be, you know, impressed and engaged with that.
Right.
And so it kind of lifted me, you know, to want to be able to really perform to the best of my ability and beyond for him. But as a person, very easy to work with, very easy to get along with. Was, you know, I think that was, especially when we were working in this, you know, up on the farm and having, you know, being in his natural environment, or especially Linda's natural environment, because she loved being up there. It was not difficult. It was, you know, it wasn't like clash of egos. I know, you know, Denny and Paul had been kind of, because they've been working together for so long, I think there was the beginnings of some friction there, but it didn't affect the work. And it you know, though we did socialize to some extent, because Paul and Linda had the kids up there too. So, you know, they're always in their family space.
Having worked with George Martin, did you think Paul's production style was informed by George Martin in any way? Did you see similarities?
That's a kind of that's a substantial question. You know, because George Martin was such an experienced producer and recognized what the lads were capable of and gave them, you know, the structure, but also the freedom. Paul, you know, Paul's very much the artist, you know, his artist as producer, as opposed to producer as producer. So that was why having Chris Thomas there as a counterbalance, to be able to let Paul kind of just be the artist at times. But there was still times when Paul would say, okay, this is how I want it to be. And Chris would go along with that because, you know, that was his job. But I think that Paul's production style is perhaps less systematic than George Martin's, you know, but my experience of working with George Martin was with Cleo Lane and John Dankworth, which was a very different context. You know, you're dealing with Cleo Lane singing a Harold Arlen song is very different from Paul McCartney singing a new Paul McCartney song, you know. So I think that it's a different style of production. And, you know, I've never worked with any two record producers that work the same way, exactly the same way. So, you know, you kind of go with the flow, as it were.
Did you get some sense of why Chris Thomas? Sorry.
Laurence, can I ask you, was there a reaction to London Town being panned by the critics as being a bit of a soft album? That happens to be my favourite, by the way. But Back to the Egg's not far behind. But was there a conscious attempt to become more new wave, do you think? And was there many discussions about that?
Well, I think that the new wave thing was just starting at that period. But punk was pretty well established. And, you know, I know that Heather had been playing a lot of kind of punk records. There was also, I mean, reggae was always, you know, not far away too. But I think that because Back to the Egg was Paul's first record for Columbia, wasn't a Capitol, wasn't going to be an EMI Capitol release. I mean, it was EMI in England, but it was for a new American record label. There was a certain amount of, I don't know whether it was pressure, but at least suggestion to do something that was more rock and roll than London Town, because London Town was kind of a folky album, largely. Even though I've Had Enough was, you know, essentially a rock song. But I think there was kind of a push to go in a more rock direction, which at least, you know, when we started, that was the primary direction that we were going in. And I think that, you know, but being with Columbia made a difference because there were different people to be impressed with what was going on. And interestingly enough, just as a side note, our A&R man at Columbia was Paul Atkinson. And Paul was, the lead guitarist with the Zombies. So, Paul had this kind of like, English, British invasion history, as it were. He later went on to run RCA and signed Jefferson Starship and Bruce Hornsby and Scandal, and was responsible for the Dirty Dancing soundtrack that I played on. So having a visit from the American A&R guy was something that was a little different from what, where Paul would normally be just be on his own in terms of what he would deliver to EMI. I don't know how much any of that made a difference. I think some of it was just the zeitgeist. It was what was going on musically in 1978 when we started making the record, and Paul being very sensitive to that. But, same thing with Good Night Tonight was, in my estimation, was never a disco record, even though it got classified as such. It was kind of a Latin dance record. And Paul was really responding to, he and Linda went out dancing one night, and that inspired him to write the song. He'd be inspired by whatever was going on around him. I think it's actually kind of interesting that the last two Wings hit singles were both dance records, because Coming Up was, was a nice up-tempo beat, and kind of the live version kind of knocked Paul's studio version out of the way, but that's a whole other story.
What was Paul's relationship with Chris Thomas actually like when it came down to it? Was Chris there to try and encourage Paul maybe to be a bit more cutting edge or a bit more?
Yeah, I think
raw?
so. I think that, Chris was there to bring some of that sensibility. I mean, and of course, Chris was a Beatle, from the Beatles era too. And much like, having Eddie, I forget Eddie's last name, one of the EMI guys. All the EMI guys had a long history with Paul. And especially Phil McDonald, because Phil had worked, on Abbey Road too. I think we would have had Jeff Emerick, but he was busy doing something else. But because Chris and Paul went back as far as they did, and Chris, when he was working on the White Album, when George Martin was not there, really kind of had learned how to deal with Paul on a creative level that, would kind of cut through any kind of ego stuff and just get to the heart of making the music.
And what sort of things were you listening to in 1978, Laurence? What was informing your contemporary music at the time?
Boz Scaggs,
Right.
Two Down, Then Left, which is Jeff Porcaro on drums and Steve Lukather on guitar. Ry Cooder. Those were like my two favorite. What was it? I think it might have been Bob Till You Drop, or maybe that was a bit later. It was one of the Ry Cooder albums I was listening to a lot.
Silk Degrees, was it? Boz Scaggs? Was that time?
No, I think it wasn't it Two Down, Then Left? It was the one before Silk Degrees, I think.
But you weren't listening to punk or new wave at the time?
Not really. It's just wasn't particularly on my radar. But, it's like, I would listen to anything if it, I get stuck in the YouTube rabbit hole, when if I go and study something, I'll kind of follow it back to its origins. So, I'm a pretty quick study whatever's going on stylistically. I think it would probably, was listening to more hard rock stuff, I'd be, whether it was Thin Lizzy or the Scorpions or stuff like that.
Were you able to talk to Paul in a meaningful way about any of the music that you were into, like including the fusion stuff and that kind of thing? Was he interested, or was that something that was a bit?
We didn't really have those discussions. Linda, I mean, for example, Linda was a big fan of Stanley Clarke, which is why Stanley ended up playing on the Tug of War album. You know, she confessed that he was her favorite bass player. But, you know, because you don't really have to think of Paul as a bass player. You know, he's an artist. I mean, the bass was not even his, what was his fourth instrument? I mean, trumpet, drums, guitar, and then bass. Oh, and keyboard. So maybe the fifth instrument. You know, I mean, you know, there might be some reference in passing, but you know, we were, I think from my perspective, I was very just hyper focused on the music that we were making. You know, I remember when we did, when we were doing the end of Getting Closer, I had spent the whole weekend like just figuring out different approaches to make that like an extended guitar solo. You know, and we recorded a whole bunch of guitar solos from me that, and Paul ended up saying, no, I think it should be like this. And he already had like the melody worked out for the very end of it. And, you know, that's he's entitled to do that. And, you know, I'd always play what he would request when he requested. And there wasn't a lot. I mean, there was only that, and there was, on Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, there was a little guitar lick that he had kind of conceived as part of the composition. But most of the time, I was free to do what I wanted.
What about what were the origins of the flamenco solo you did on Good Night Tonight? How did that come about?
Well, we were at Rude Studio, you know, because we couldn't get into Abbey Road in January of 1980. I think Cliff Richard had block booked it, and then Kate Bush was, you know, on his heels. So Paul built this replica of the control room of Studio 2, and the plan was at that point we thought we were done recording and we were going to just mix. So we had the echo chambers like coming in over high resolution phone lines from Abbey Road, and we had all the gear that we needed to mix the record. But then Paul came in on the Monday morning with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, and you know the studio was literally like just a little kind of lobby area with a little kitchenette, and we set up the drums in the kitchenette, and we were all just kind of huddled around. It was really like a home studio, and we started work. We cut the track for Daytime, Nighttime Suffering, did some overdubs on that, and then went back to Good Night Tonight, and we're cooking it up with some guitar stuff. And there was an area where, you know, I forget whether it was Paul or Chris Thomas said, hey, you know, something kind of a Spanish style thing would work there. And they all looked at me, and I said, well, I don't have an acoustic guitar with me. So I borrowed Denny's Ovation Adamus, and they set up a mic, and I, you know, just played the first thing that came out of my fingers. And I said something like that, and they said exactly like that, and that was what was on the record. So it was like first take.
Right.
Can I ask
that thing of, you know, like the improv thing of just being able to kind of be in the musical moment and not think about it.
Yeah.
You know, and just again a side note, Tom Scott's soprano sax on "Listen to What the Man Said" was him warming up. He was playing it with, you know, this is from, because I wasn't at that session, but Denny said that Tom was playing the sax with one hand and writing out the chord changes with the other, but playing along with what he was hearing, and that was what ended up on the record. So,
yeah. Can I ask you about Coming Up, Laurence? When the single came out, were you a bit put out that he'd recorded a solo version? I know the live version got to #1 in America, but us in Britain were subjected to the studio version. So what's your feelings about the two versions? How do you compare them, and what do you think?
Well, it wasn't a surprise because we had heard it. We learned it from that, or at least the rough mix version of that. And so that was part of our show, you know, when we did the UK tour. It was recorded in the second night in Glasgow. And once Paul got out of jail and we were back in the studio we were actually at Rack Studios when we doubled the horns. We had the horn section come in and doubled them up. And that was kind of the last I thought about it. I mean, I knew that because of this deal that Paul had with Columbia, where he had a certain number of albums that he had to deliver, and McCartney II was going to be the next one up. But Wings was still a functional entity at that point. It's just, Paul had this solo album. And when they put it out, they put the live version on the B-side, which was cool. The record did not do well, even though they debuted the video on Saturday Night Live. The record was not getting much airplay until the DJs discovered that there was a live version, and then that went to #1. But it started off, the chart reports, the Billboard reports were on the studio version, and then it flipped and went over to the live in Glasgow one. So, which much to Columbia Records' chagrin, because they were forced to include a white label 7-inch single with the album, because people were buying the album expecting what they were hearing on the radio and not getting it. So they ended up including the live version with the McCartney II record. But I think what it represents from my perspective is that Wings, as we were constituted, really was a rock band. But where Paul was going with his creativity, first of all with the McCartney II stuff, which was, definitely kind of quirky and, playing in the studio with electronica. But then subsequently with the Tug of War stuff and Pipes of Peace, and you could see that when we were rehearsing the Tug of War stuff, we were doing it in a rehearsal, like in a hall. But this was material that normally I would have expected to have been worked out in the studio, because they weren't rock songs. They were pop songs and narrative songs and things that needed to be textured and dealt with in a very different way. So you had, Paul has a band that could play some kick-ass rock and roll, but he's not writing stuff like that. The one song that he did have that we never actually did was No Values, which he said he dreamt he wrote a Rolling Stones song. But when he did it for the Broad Street movie, he didn't rock out as much as he should have, and he kind of wrote a new bit for it that really took it somewhere else. But it was clear, with songs like Ebony and Ivory and Average Person and stuff like that, that these weren't rock songs. You didn't need a rock and roll band to make a record like that. And then, I think, again, with some pressure from Columbia Records, that was when George Martin got brought in. And that was really the point where, okay, so this is no longer going to be a Wings album. And that was really kind of the beginning of the end of the band. But we were still in the studio in January of 1981, working on the Cold Cut stuff. And a few things came out of that, like A Love for You. I'd put some slide guitar on that, and that ended up in a movie. And, at that point, I was already making plans to move to New York anyway, because I'd seen the writing on the wall. So,
how did Paul go about announcing to the band that he was working on McCartney II, and that was going to be coming out as his next release as part of the Columbia deal?
Well, I think, Paul's entitled to do whatever he likes. And so it was like, because he had the time over the summer and some gear to play around with, and and he felt like, I can do an album this way. I don't need the band.
Did it come as a surprise or a shock?
No, I was busy working on my own album at the time. I mean, my Standard Time record, which was stuff out of Paul's publishing catalog, was recorded right around that. It was August, September of that year. You just kind of go with the flow under those circumstances. I mean, it's not like you're going to argue with Paul McCartney saying, well, you can't do this, And, I think that Arrow Through Me really was a bit of a precursor to McCartney II, because it was that very stripped down kind of kind of, with a little quirkiness to it, with a double speed drum kit and stuff like that on it. That I still think is one of his best songs of that era. I'm surprised that it hasn't been covered by jazz singers, because it's actually really a very cool, very cool song.
And how was that recorded? Because on the video, you're all playing keyboards.
Right, but on the record, it's just Paul and Steve Holley, because there's no bass.
So you're not on the record at all?
Not on that, no. I contributed to the horn arrangement,
Right.
but not on the actual recording, because it was just literally, it was Paul playing electric piano, and Steve playing two drum kits, played regular drums and double speed drums, and that was it, plus the horns. But that Paul will do stuff like that. I mean, he did it with the Beatles, where he'd run in the studio and cook up a track all by himself. I mean, because he can. But I think that the process by which we did Back to the Egg, and then we didn't actually perform it live for some months after the record was released, I think was very much part of that kind of the slowing down, because I think prior to that, they would have put the record out and immediately gone out on the road. Record comes out in June. We didn't tour until November. Steve and I went to New York and promoted the release. And then, they had, but even the video special that we did, which was broadcast in America, I think didn't get broadcast until October or November of that year too. So there was a little kind of out of sync in terms of the way that perhaps in a previous release might have happened.
We had to wait 2 years in the UK for the BBC to finally air Back to the Egg.
Really, it took that long?
2 years,
okay. Yeah, I was already by then. I was already in
yeah.
So yeah, but that's how these things happen sometimes.
And if that was, I mean, if MTV had come along in '79, and there might have been a different story about the success of that album.
Well, that's true, because I remember I went to see Hunter Ronson in New York, and they were filming it for something that was going to be called MTV. It was like 1980. So we were I think part of the problem there was that we were actually kind of a little ahead of the curve. The other thing that happened in the States was that Old Siam Sir was a single, but it came out the same time as the Knack's Old My Sharona, which had a very similar riff, because both records were coming from this kind of power pop / rock perspective, and some of the radio stations would play the tracks back to back. And again, ironically, that was, the Knack were on Capitol. So all the energy that would have gone into Back to the Egg from Capitol actually went into the Get the Knack album. And Columbia, not having the institutional memory of how to promote McCartney, which Capitol did, I think just they kind of took it for granted that it was going to sell multi-millions simply because it was McCartney. And, and I mentioned earlier the fact that you had, Rumors and these albums that were, and Boston, that were selling substantial numbers. But literally the week that Back to the Egg came out, there was a recession in America. They dated the recession to that week. And so kind of like the bottom fell out of the record market at the same time. So, if the record had been released even 6 months earlier, it probably would have sold double or triple. If Goodnight Tonight had been on it, it would have sold a lot more. And perhaps under those circumstances, the critics would have been less critical. But, I think that, and it wasn't all the critics either. I mean, it was just, enough to get Paul kind of feeling a bit jaundiced about it.
In my opinion, Old Siam Sir is one of the last great rockers that Paul did. Where did that monstrous riff come from?
Are you talking about on the instrumental section?
Yeah.
That came out of the jam. That was when Steve was playing piano and Paul and I were playing guitar, and somehow it just, I forget who started it, but that's where it came from.
Do you feel, Laurence, that ultimately Paul did not keep faith with Wings based on the sales of Back to the Egg? And we're talking about a platinum selling album in America here. Do you think that was his decision to say, okay, I'm going to do this by myself? I can't cope with a critical failure, even though everyone here tonight thinks it's brilliant?
I'm not sure that that's quite that black and white with it. It might have been a contributing factor. I think an equally contributing factor was the fact that Wings was Paul and Linda's band, and Linda was just getting tired. She, and they, in the course of doing it, they had moved out of London. They were no longer at Cavendish, they were at Peasmarsh, and the kids were in local schools. It was one of the reasons we worked at Lim Castle, was because it was an easy drive for them. So that, and then of course, by the time, the Paul got busted in Tokyo, which was kind of very hard on Linda because they'd never been apart for that long. And it was, it was not an easy period at all. But I think it just got to the point where it was, Paul was ready for a change of direction. So, but, you kind of expect changes of direction. With Wings, I mean, the fact that it went through the number of incarnations that it did.
If we could take you back to the rehearsals prior to the 79 tour, please. I believe they were in Eastbourne.
The Eastbourne rehearsals were when we had the full tech.
Right.
We were in the theatre. Yeah.
How did you decide? How was it decided what was going to go on the set list, and what did you jam or record or rehearse or whatever, which didn't actually make it onto the final set list?
Well, I think that by the time we got to Eastbourne, we pretty much were set with what was going to be in the show. The place that we were kind of working it out was actually in this little, almost like a shed near Peasmarsh. There's that video that we did for the Japanese, like a little promo for the Japanese tour, where we were rehearsing. We started rehearsing Coming Up, and we did With a Little Luck, which we dropped, even though that had been a hit single. It just didn't feel right. Again, because it was kind of like a very pop single, as opposed to the band, which was kind of leaning more towards a rock and roll direction. I know that we opened with Got to Get You Into My Life because Earth, Wind and Fire had a hit with it. Which I think from the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack, the movie soundtrack or something. But I think that kind of spurred Paul to say, oh, wait a minute, that's my song. And it was a good opener too.
And he also did 20 Flight Rock, which is a song obviously very personal to Paul.
Oh yeah, well that was his audition piece for John, wasn't it? And I think Paul liked to strap on a guitar and play a bit. Hot as Sun, again, I mean, that was kind of Paul wanting to play some guitar, plug the Epiphone into the AC30, and but those were the only two that he played electric guitar on, if I recall.
And it must have been great doing Every Night, Laurence, because you do a good solo on that, and it was a song which has not been played by him up to that point.
That's true. Yeah, that was kind of a cool one to do. And I just kind of approached it pretty freely in terms of what I did with it. The curious one was Maybe I'm Amazed, because he changed the arrangement on that. The sequence of the song is a little different from the original version, or for the version that he did, with Jimmy and Joe English. But yeah, I mean, I think that Every Night was because he'd never done that at all, had he? It was not in any of the lists. So that was kind of a refreshing thing, I think.
But it still hasn't done it since.
And I don't understand why, because it's such a great song.
I know.
But yeah, but then he has more than a few great songs. I mean, let's face it.
Did you get any insight into how he would make those decisions? Like how he would suddenly say, right, we're going to just play this song now that I haven't played for whatever 10 years?
I don't recall much in the way of discussion as to how the set list was going to go. I mean, putting together a set list has its, has its pitfalls, because you can say, oh, I want to do this song, but then if you do it kind of like after another song that's in the same key, you lose a certain amount of impact. So it's a juggling act when you're doing stuff like that. And I think probably my feeling was I just stay out of the way. Yeah.
So was that set list decided entirely by McCartney, or like did like yourself, like and others have like some input and like suggestions? Just considering it is quite, there's a lot of deep cuts in it, like things like Every Night and like Hot as Sun and that, and certainly like Today he keeps it rather safe with his set list. So was that like the influence of like yourself, like or others?
I don't think I had any real influence on that set list. I mean, there were certain things like Cook of the House was in there because Paul wanted Linda to have a vocal. Let It Be was just such a natural thing to put in there, and I'm not sure what the motivation was. I mean, there were very few Beatles songs. We had Got to Get You Into My Life, we had Fool on the Hill, we had Let It Be, Yesterday. Not like in recent years where it's basically kind of a Beatle tribute band.
We've not heard the word Rockestra mentioned yet, I don't think, during this chat. What's your memories of that, Laurence, in terms of the vibe in the room? Was there any egos among all the people who gathered for it?
Rockestra was actually remarkably ego-free. It was really like everybody just was in there just being part of it. And that's the thing, is because Paul commands so much respect amongst his peers, that him, kind of being the musical director of it all and just kind of assigning the parts, everybody just went with it, and it's, I mean, for me, it was like remarkable because I've got Hank Marvin right next to me, who's my childhood hero. And then, next to him, Denny Lane, and then Dave Gilmour and Pete Townsend. I mean, I was in heaven, and, there's John Bonham on drums and Steve Holley and Kenny Jones. And it was really, it was a remarkable band. And there were a lot of technical challenges involved in it because they were running, first time I'd ever seen two 24-track machines running in sync. They had to bring in an extra console into the control room for all the inputs. But ego-wise, everybody was cool about it. I mean, and it's unfortunate that the full movie never got edited together because, the whole thing was filmed and there was that short promo that got kind of resurfaced, but they had neglected to get releases from everybody. When you do videos, you're supposed to get a release saying it's okay.
I think there's a suggestion as to why there's been a delay with the archive collection. There might be still some issues around that potentially.
I have no idea.
No.
I have not heard anything about the archive collection. I'm doing an interview for the documentary. I'm doing an interview this coming week. That's I forget who the director is, but it's the documentary that covers that 70s period.
Is that the Man on the Run documentary?
It could be. I'm not sure, actually. Let me hang on.
Morgan Neville, I think, was announced in February, so it has been announced.
Hang on. There's a few documentaries. This is the MPO one that Morgan Neville is directing.
Yeah, that's the one. Man on the Run, it's called. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Yeah.
Can't wait.
Yeah, he does. I mean, he did 20 Feet from Stardom, which is a great documentary. But the interviews are all audio only, so there's going to be a lot of visuals because they're not doing. Normally you're kind of like a talking head, when you do interviews. But for this one, it's just an audio thing. But they're coming over here on Tuesday to do that. I have not heard anything more about the archive collection.
What about the that amazing final Wings concert in Glasgow, which obviously there's bootlegs floating around, Wings Last Flight. It was professionally recorded.
Well, Jeff Emmerich engineered it.
Yeah. Will that ever see the light of day? I mean, there's been a few tracks that have sort of seeped out on the archive editions over time, bonus editions, but we've not had that whole concert, which is an amazing
I
concert.
imagine that if and when, or when and if the archive collection comes out, that would be on it, along with the Campuchia video, and probably the Rupert demos too, because there's the Rupert Bear stuff that we did it was like a one-day thing when we were up in Scotland. But some of that stuff turned out really nicely too. Actually, amazing how much we accomplished in a day for that. And by the end, you can hear the piano starting to go out of tune.
There's just so much material from that period, visual and audio, that it could be included in an archive edition. It's we just hope Paul gets around to it.
Well, one would hope so. It's hard to know. I mean, he found the time to do 80 singles. Have the box sitting over there. Yeah.
But Laurence, I mean, speak on behalf of the people in this group and numerous others. We think it's scandalous that London Town and Back to the Egg have not received archive treatment. I mean, they're not minor albums. They're fucking great albums. So I just don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't quite understand it either. And next time I have any communication with Paul, I actually intend to kind of bring it up.
Yeah. If he doesn't, suddenly we'll send John round to sort him out. So,
yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a mystery, but I mean, I imagine that at some point in the foreseeable future, it'll come out. Right now, I mean, today is Red Road Speedway vinyl, at least over here it is. And, I don't know if there's going to be anything different about, because Band on the Run 50th anniversary is coming up in December.
Well, we don't need another version of that because we've already got it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just waiting for these last two Wings albums. And if he brings out an archive edition of Broad Street, we're all going to...
Yeah, we don't need that.
be so upset.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's a little bit like the whole selective memory that all the Beatles had about the Let It Be movie. They had it in their heads that it was a terrible time, and Peter Jackson's remake of that is joyous. It shows the complete opposite of how they felt about it at the time. Do you think Paul might have, for whatever reason, got it into his head that it's not a great album just based on the relative lack of sales, and that he might reappraise it and see the light as we've done over the years?
I mean, one refers to relative lack of sales. It's still, I don't think any subsequent album has sold as much as Back to the Egg. Or maybe Tug of War did because of the Michael Jackson stuff there too. But
he's got something in his head that it's not a good album.
Well, I think, yeah. But the fact is that, the Let It Be period, was a hard time for the Beatles. I mean, the band was, functionally breaking up. But the beauty of the documentary is that it shows that it didn't matter what the friction was, that just got turned into creative energy. I think that, but I do think that that particular period, the Back to the Egg period for Paul, because he was turning 40 and because Linda was getting tired and because he got busted, and it's just kind of, he compartmentalized that. But that doesn't account for why London Town hasn't been dealt with too. And I think it just may be that it just hasn't fully come onto his radar. Too busy writing the musical version of It's a Wonderful Life, I think.
Laurence, you mentioned earlier that there might have been some tension finally between Paul and Denny towards the end of Wings.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able or willing to explore that any further as
Not
a
really. I mean, other than,
topic?
I know that Jojo didn't get along with Paul and Linda. But then, Denny and Jojo were kind of, not long after, separated anyway. I think that Denny had some frustration that the band just wasn't more active. I think that and the fact that Denny was the one who brought me and Steve into the band, in order to keep it going. I'm not sure if Denny hadn't been kind of the talent scout, I'm not sure whether they would have like immediately kind of done what became Back to the Egg as a Wings album. Paul might have, I'm just speculating now, but that he could have easily just gone into doing a solo album, and having all the Columbia releases be like that. So I think that, that Denny was certainly getting frustrated that it just wasn't as active as he wanted it to be. I don't think Denny really truly enjoyed the process of recording, because, you can make a record in a week, or you can make a record in a year, and in the case of Back to the Egg, I mean, from the time we started it to the time it was released was what, about, I don't know, 9-10 months. Could have had a baby in that time.
How was Again and Again and Again written? Did you see part of the process and the interplay between Paul and Denny? Because it was 2 songs that Paul, I believe, suggested.
Oh yeah, I mean, we were sitting there discussing the fact that Denny had these 2 songs, and Paul said, "Why don't you just put them together, make one song out of it?" Which is exactly what we did. That was another one we did in Scotland. That was in the first batch, and I always like that song. I think it's it's the thing about Denny is that he's got this kind of interesting kind of R&B soul sensibility, but infused with kind of an English folky kind of thing too. And it's kind of, you get both of those elements in that song. That was a fun one to record.
That's why it's even more of a shame that Wings splits at that time as well. I mean, we deserved a second album from you and Steve, I think, definitely, from that lineup. It's amazing. How did you feel on that last concert coming off the stage at the Glasgow Apollo? And how did the rest of the band feel? And where did you go after that?
Well, I mean, it felt good. It was a good concert. And, that was the end of the bulk of the tour. I mean, Kampuchea came up after Christmas when I think we'd all had a bit too much turkey. And that was a very long show too. I mean, we didn't go on stage until quite late. But the Glasgow show, I mean, was very satisfying. And that was kind of, where we were, that was really the starting point for what we were going to be doing in Japan, but swapping out some songs. I know we had added Another Day was on the Japanese set list because that had been a big hit in Japan. And Let 'Em In was back in the repertoire. Live and Let Die was back in the repertoire. I don't remember anything else that was different. And I forget what we were dropping from the that Glasgow set list. But
was there an after show party after Glasgow?
I don't recall.
Must have been a good one.
I mean, there were, well, not necessarily. I was never a heavy drinker. So, I mean, after every show, there was always some kind of, hang backstage. I mean, of course, now nobody does that. It's like you have your pre-show and then, everybody scarpers right after they get off stage. But in those days, you'd hang out a bit afterwards. But I don't recall, any kind of, big bash after that. Because it was not, there was no sense that this was going to be a kind of a final concert. Because especially because we knew we were going to be doing Kampuchea a week later, and then going to Japan, the following month.
Do you think McCartney really wanted to do the Japanese tour, especially just considering like what happened when he got there? Like, do you think it was a kind of like he was almost there's a lot of theories around that he almost got busted like deliberately, or was he kind of genuinely like up for the tour?
We were pretty. I thought that we were in pretty good shape. I talked to Steve Holly the other day, who said he felt like, maybe we were not quite up to par. But, I thought that the new material had worked him well. And as you could tell, I mean, with the Glasgow show, the band was tight, and Paul was particular. I mean, his bass playing in that period, especially playing the Yamaha bass, which had much more robust bottom end than the Rickenbacker, that his bass playing was sensational. And he and Steve were just such a tight rhythm section. But I think that it was kind of an unfortunate circumstance. I mean, the fact that they decided that they were going to travel with half an ounce of cannabis was, not the best move. And it almost wasn't discovered. I was standing next to him, when the customs man on the very last suitcase kind of patted a jacket and then felt something inside it and lifted it up, and there was this bag of grass. And that was when all hell broke loose. But it almost, he almost got away with it.
Was there any comeback on the rest of you with the Japanese authorities there? Or did they just purely focus on where it was found, whose suitcase it was in?
Well, I mean, the rest of the band had come the other way from London direct to Tokyo. I had visited a friend in New York, so I stayed at the same hotel as the McCartneys in New York, and then traveled on to Tokyo with them. And I had picked up a 1957 Les Paul Gold Top on 48th Street, which I was hand carrying with me. So when the customs people pulled us into this back area, and Linda and I were in a room, and then Paul was being interrogated basically in an adjacent room. And then a couple of the customs guys took me into a room by myself with the guitar and handed me a screwdriver. And I had to take the truss rod cover and the back plates off of the guitar to show them there was nothing stashed in there. Wow. Which was, a little kind of adding insult to injury at that point. But there was, because Paul, I think the issue there ultimately was that Paul had signed an affidavit declaring that he didn't smoke it anymore. And that was how the Justice Department were talked into giving him a work permit. And so when he got busted, some of the senior officials kind of got a little, pissed off about that, because their reputations were on the line. So that was why, they made a bigger deal out of it with Paul than they would have done with any, the reggae bands would get busted all the time, and they just take the weed away and let them do their tours. I mean.
And you were standing next to Paul at that very moment. What did he say? Or what was his demeanor after that?
He turned very pale. And then, there was really, at that point, we didn't talk again until he was back in England, because he was whisked away immediately.
And what was Linda's reaction?
Oh, Linda was devastated. We were kind of hopeful that it would blow over, because when we were driving from the airport to the hotel, Paul was being detained, but Linda and the kids and I were driving to the hotel, and everywhere you looked, there were Wings posters. It was just on every streetlight and everything. And we thought, well, maybe this is going to blow over. But by the time we got to the hotel, it was on the news that he'd been arrested. And the next morning, all the signage had gone away. All the posters were gone.
Did it cause any tension in the band that he'd got busted and you were kind of looking forward to this tour?
Well, we were definitely kind of upset. I think more upset that Paul was kind of, incarcerated than anything else. But it was a disappointment, certainly. I was disappointed because I was really anticipating that the band was going to get up to the next level. Because, we'd done 3 weeks worth of shows, and, we were just really getting tight, as you can hear from the Glasgow show, but it could have gone further. But I just think that it kind of, that was the point where, Paul was Paul and Linda were questioning whether they wanted to be on the road. And then, of course, after John died, I mean, they didn't tour again until the end of the 80s.
Were you able to visit Paul?
Hang on, you froze. Hang on, I've lost audio now.
Were you able to visit Paul in jail?
No, oh no. We were, in fact, after we'd been in Japan for about 3 days, they said, okay, it's time to leave. You know, it's going to be better for Paul if you're not here. So everybody left. The whole band and the whole crew left. And I went to LA. I got off the plane and went to Venice Beach, and there was someone selling T-shirts with Wings Japan tour cancelled.
Did you buy one?
I did. I don't know what happened to it, but I did buy one. Yeah.
Laurence, can I just ask you, this question is a slight tangent. It was just a thing you mentioned earlier. It's just about Scotland, really. I've always been really curious to know what it was like up there on the farm in Scotland. I mean, I've read all kinds of accounts of it, mainly from the Back to the Egg days, various stories of just how rough it was and how out of the way it was and how difficult it was potentially. What was it like being cooped up there, miles from anywhere?
I mean, you're not really cooped up because you're surrounded by, Scottish scenery, and a lot of rabbits. The fields at night, you'd shine the headlights on a field and it would be all like, thousands of rabbits. I enjoyed it because I had spent, I grew up in London. I never really got to be out in the countryside for any length of time. And I'd spent the previous 3-4 years basically being in the studio 7 days a week. So, being able to get out into this kind of bucolic, Scottish scenery was not unpleasant. The way that it was set up was that we were, to begin with, there was a barn, which is what became the studio. But then there was another kind of like a recreation room that we actually used for rehearsing in to begin with. And if you went upstairs, there was kind of like a dormitory where there were separate bedrooms. They weren't fully enclosed, but there was privacy. And then there was the cottage a little further down the way. At one point I stayed in the cottage, but when we first went up there, we were all in this kind of little dormitory space. For me, I enjoyed it. Hey, I mean, I've been plucked out of the recording studio. I'm in Scotland working with Paul McCartney, and it's, it was a life-changing thing. And now, in the context, my father had passed away a month before I joined the band, so my life was kind of undergoing a major turn at that point. So I enjoyed the process. It was a little different, as time went on, when we went down to Lim Castle and we're staying at a hotel in, down on the south coast, and then back to Abbey Road, where I was actually I had just bought a little house in London, and so I could stay in, staying in my own place. And it was interesting being in these different environments too. Being in a medieval castle is kind of a cool place to make a record. Challenging acoustically, but cool. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the work is the focus. When the work is the focus, then everything else kind of falls, kind of fits into that context. I mean, touring as a solo acoustic guitar player is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but the gig is the focus. So everything else, the travel side of it is just supportive of that. But it was a great experience for me. I mean, I look at it, I described it as I got my bachelor's degree from London University and my master's from McCartney University. It was it was a great education because I was just soaking in all of it, whether it was the writing or the arranging, the recording, the production, just all of that stuff. So I certainly had no complaints about that. But, and socializing, I mean, there was in Campbelltown. Now, the sad thing is that now Campbelltown is one of the great Scotch whiskey places. But then it was really, they weren't distilling whiskey in Campbell. They had in the past, and they do now, but the economy around there had kind of dipped. But there was a hotel some of the crew was staying at with a decent bar and food, and we could go there and relax. And there were things along the way. I mean, I remember at one point we got a screening of the Buddy Holly story at a cinema that was up there, where the I think it was the director came up and did it. And then there was a point where the playwright Willie Russell came and hung out with us for a week and wrote, subsequently wrote a script for a movie called Band on the Run, of which I am a character. I'm a character in a Willie Russell script. But that was sidelined later in favor of Give My Regards to Broad Street.
What a pity.
It wasn't boring. Let me say that.
Was it plumbed in by then?
I'm sorry?
Was it plumbed in by the time you were there? Was the running water and amenities and everything on the farm?
We had running water. I mean, I don't know about earlier. No, I mean, it was relatively civilized. I mean, the newspaper didn't get delivered in the morning, but there were cars available to go into Campbelltown and pick up supplies or whatever.
So
can I ask you about the Again and Again and Again video, because it's my favorite of all of the Back to the Egg videos? You in the field.
Oh, in the field, yeah.
With Linda putting flowers in your hair. It seems like you were having a blast. And
it's fun.
Paul's playing acoustic guitar, even though he's actually playing bass. If you watch the video, he's actually trying to play bass on the acoustic guitar.
Actually, I'm surprised. Well, his Zemaitis acoustic bass, which is the one that he played on To You, is a little too big to really play standing up comfortably.
Yeah.
So when you're doing videos, I mean, you're just playing along with the record. I don't think anybody really expects to actually watch your fingers and see what you're really doing.
But what was that like? I mean, were they playing the song? Were you playing along to a recording of the song in the field, or what happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, you always do these things to playback.
And was it a fun session? How long did it take, that particular thing, that video?
Probably an afternoon. I honestly don't remember. I mean, we did a bunch of videos in just in a few days. I remember being in the aircraft hangar for Spin It On, because they had behind us, there was behind the stage, there was this huge bank of spotlights, and we were wearing like fur-lined flight jackets, and the amount of heat that was coming off these lights. I mean, when I took that jacket off when I got home that night, I hung it up, and 3 days later it was still dripping. I mean, it was like we were soaked.
Do you still have the jacket?
No. I think when I left England, that's a few things I gave as gifts to my cleaning lady, because she was such a nice woman.
What about the red jacket you've got on the front cover of Back to the Egg? Is that still with you?
No, I think I outgrew that years ago.
Sure.
I still have the there was a kind of a maroon jacket that was the tour jacket, the UK tour jacket, with a kind of a faux fur collar. I have that. And I have the Japanese, the Udo tour jacket. That's like a baseball jacket, blue one. And I have a scarf that has the Rockestra. It was a Rockestra scarf, and a little bracelet, a Back to the Egg bracelet too.
Yeah.
Just a few things that kind of,
So if you had to pick your top 3 songs from Back to the Egg, what would they be?
Well, I'm always fond of Spin It On. When I do any of the Wing stuff live, I do Getting Closer. I do Spin It On. I think that Arrow Through Me is just such a great song, great songwriting. But I do Rockestra too. It's hard to pick 3 of anything. You ask me on a different day, I'll probably pick 3 different songs. But
It must be very hard doing Rockestra on your own as well, Laurence.
well, I don't do it solo. Actually, I have done it with me and with.
I'm sure you can.
Steve Holly playing cajon and me playing just acoustic guitar. We've actually done it that way. No, but I've got, when there's enough musicians on stage, it only takes a couple of guitar players. Actually, I can do it. As long as I've got a rhythm section, I can do it.
And what about Love Awake? Do you like that one?
Oh yeah, that's a lovely one.
It's great, isn't it?
I played bass on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I played bass and I did all the guitar stuff. When we cut the track, Paul and Denny were playing acoustic guitars. I played bass. And then when we went to redo the bass part, I was expecting Paul to do it. And he said, no, I like what you played, you do it. So he actually knelt down on the floor and gave me a lesson in how I should be picking, how I should pick the bass. So
did you then become Linda's favorite bass player?
What's that?
Did you then become Linda's favorite bass player?
I'd never be Linda's favorite bass player, but that was an interesting song. It's a good song, I think.
Were there any other tracks where you played bass, or was that the only one?
No, that was the only one.
Yeah.
But I did do I did some guitar synthesizer stuff on Reception, on the Reading, whatever that's called.
Podcast.
Yeah. All the orchestral stuff was just a mellotron, ebow, Paul playing a gizmotron, the Godley and Cream gizmotron, which kind of bows the strings, and guitar synthesizers. So we kind of did a lot of fake orchestra stuff.
When Paul was giving you the sort of the playing bass demo and sort of kneeling down on the floor, what was he doing? Was he doing something that was different to? In what way was it different to what you would have been doing normally?
I think just in terms of where he would have picked it, because where you pick in relation to the bridge and the neck and the pickups makes a difference to the sound. And he was just kind of giving me a little guidance in that direction. It's interesting, of the bass player, and I've worked with many great bass players over the years, but the one bass player who plays the most like Paul is Carol Kay, who is, on Pet Sounds, and she picks in a very similar way. But she also was a guitar player before she was a bass player. So that was my bass lesson from Paul.
Brilliant.
Laurence, you mentioned January 1981 sessions. Cold Cuts. So that was obviously in the immediate aftermath of John's death.
Right.
Did you notice any kind of difference in Paul then? Did he open up to you about John and how it affected him?
No, but we had, not long after John died, it was only about a week later that we had the MPL Christmas lunch. Right. Paul was Paul was subdued, he was there was a deep sadness there. By January, we were there to work. And so we didn't get into those kind of any personal discussions about that.
Yeah.
But I do remember the day I was leaving, they were working on Tug of War at Air Studios. And I went to say goodbye because I was taking off for New York that night. And shortly before I got there, there'd been, a death threat on Paul and his family in New York. And so they had some security people came in. It got uncomfortable. And I'm sure that, a big reason for not touring, for such a long time was just the vulnerability of it. But it was curious because while I was at the studio, I got a phone call from Tony Visconti, record producer, who at the time was still married to Mary Hopkin. And he wanted to know if I could do a record with Mary the following week. And I said, I'm going to be in New York, so I couldn't do it. But ironically, not long after I say not long, I mean, in December of 1978, Tony asked me to go to Switzerland to do a record with Rick Wakeman. And I went to Paul and said, do you mind if I do this? And he said, no, go ahead, it's fine. And then the next day he changed his mind. He said, thinking about it, I really want people to think of this as a group and not as studio musicians, so no. So I missed out on Rick Wakeman and Mary Hopkin.
But 6 months after the aborted Japanese tour, you're in Nice together with Paul and Ringo.
That's right.
How did that come about?
When Wings got together, we were rehearsing some stuff, I think in June, and Paul said, hey, we want to come and do a record with Ringo. So, I guess he still looked at me as being a valuable asset. And so we went and spent a week or so, 10 days at Super Bear Studios, which is where Pink Floyd had done some of Wall. And recorded Private Property, Attention, Sure to Fall, and You Can't Fight Lightning, which was a very weird jam that was almost the title track of the Stop and Smell the Roses album. And then we did Linda's Love's Full Glory.
Oh, I love that song.
And you did the solo on Private Property, right?
I did.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah.
And what was the atmosphere like in those sessions? I mean, I know Ringo was probably at the height of his alcohol abuse or whatever, but he was with Bob.
Ringo was actually pretty sober.
Was he?
Yeah. It was a lot of kind of bonhomie. After all, we were in France, so it was very much kind of. I mean, Paul and Ringo together would just they had so much history. And Linda was, they were all great friends.
How different was it playing with Paul and Ringo compared to Paul and Steve?
Well, it was different. I mean, just for me to sit there and it's like playing with half the Beatles. It's pretty cool. I mean, Ringo's a very different drummer to Steve. Steve has his own style. But Ringo, it was fascinating because the first time through the songs, Ringo's fills were all in the right place. The groove was exactly right. We really didn't spend a lot of time cutting those tracks. Spent a lot more time just kind of, sweetening things. But, the tracks went down pretty quickly.
And I don't think you appeared in the MPL video, The Cooler, fortunately. I don't know if you've seen that at all.
I was gone at that point. I was in New York. So yeah, I hadn't, other than Wings, the only other video stuff that I did a video with Godley and Cream on a song called Wide Boys that I had played on for them. But not a lot of video stuff, not a lot of other video stuff.
How did you feel about being in the Wonderful Christmas Time video? Because
there was that. Yeah,
you didn't have anything to do with it. Did it feel strange being in the video?
No, it was just it's all in a day's work.
You did that at Wembley, Wonderful Christmas Time.
Yeah, we did. That was part of the set list because that was a current single. When we were touring.
How did you feel about him releasing that under his own name as opposed to Wings?
It was fine. Really didn't, I mean, it was Wings were Wings and Paul was Paul, and I think that because Wings was really existing, at least in my mind, as kind of as its own entity, and the fact that Back to the Egg had been released as a Wings album, not a Paul McCartney and Wings album.
Yeah.
I think it was what it was. I was frustrated because I'd done an instrumental arrangement of the Christmas song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, which Paul was Paul had in his publishing catalog, but I couldn't get a record label to release it to go along with the tour. But
and how did Paul break the news to you that Wings were no longer going to be a working band or exist at all? How did that
well,
happen?
I mean, the initial thing was when he called and said, you know, George Martin doesn't want this to be a Wings album, and so you're not coming to Montserrat. You know, and I said, okay, well, but he said, but you know, we're getting together in January because we still have stuff to finish up. But that was functionally that was the point at which. But I'd already been making plans to move to New York at that point anyway. So again, this goes back to knowing that there was going to be a limited lifespan of my involvement.
So on that last session, you knew this is it. This is the last time I'm like working with Paul. Yeah,
when we did the cold cut stuff, I knew that was going to be it, because I was moving. I had work lined up in New York, and then I'd only been there a couple of months, and I met Hope, and she was from LA, and I moved out to LA and reinvigorated my studio career here in LA.
I mean, Paul's output from the 80s is brilliant, and there are some absolutely wonderful songs throughout those years. But I watched a video the other night from our own influencer here, James Griffiths, where he talked to another influencer about Wings. And so many people who get into McCartney don't know the name Wings. They don't understand that there was a band Wings, and it's like Wings hasn't survived. I accept that Wings' lineup was never the same from one album to another, but surely one of the great bands of the 1970s is Wings. And what McCartney achieved with Back to the Egg was as good as anything that Wings did. Why do you think he walked away from that and just said, okay, I'm Paul?
Like I say, because it was Paul and Linda's band, and Linda was just getting tired. She didn't want, they didn't want to be schlepping around the world, dragging the kids out of school, and they wanted to have a more normal family life. I think they felt like they owed it to the kids, and look how they turned out. They Mary and Stella in particular just have had these great careers, and I think that it was just getting to be too much to handle. And Paul, having turning 40 as he was, when you look at what's going on in your life and you kind of reevaluate it. And the 70s was a different, the 80s was a different era to the 70s. The music business had changed quite radically right around that time. I think that I think if Back to the Egg had been done by a band that wasn't, Paul McCartney, that it probably would have been treated differently. Because it was kind of in tune with a lot of the stylistic stuff that was going on at that time, and in some cases kind of epitomized it. But Paul doesn't stand still, and he doesn't look back.
Is it possible John Lennon's death had any impact on the fact that Wings didn't survive into 1981 and beyond?
Oh, most definitely, because again, it was. With John dying, the vulnerability aspect meant that the idea of touring, brought its own dangers at that point, and so that I think that had an impact, but it wasn't the only reason. It was part of it, and. For me, from my perspective, it's like I'd done my tour of duty and I was ready to move on.
And just finally from me, you recorded with George in 86, Breath Away from Heaven. Did George talk much about the work that you've done with Wings?
Wasn't it Someplace Else I played on? Not Breath Away. Someplace else.
I thought it was Breath Away from Heaven, but I could be wrong. But anyway, how did that whole session go? And was George talking about his time with Paul or your time with Paul?
Oh, yeah. I mean, George was very chatty. very chatty about his role in the Beatles and his perceptions about it. I mean, I really enjoyed talking with him. Those sessions, similar team had worked with Donovan a few months earlier on a Japanese album, but Jim Keltner was playing drums. Prescott Niles from the Knack was on bass. I forget who played keyboards on that.
Was this at Friar Park, Lawrence?
No, this was actually at Sound City.
Ah, right. And when was this? What?
Before it became famous for Nirvana, it was kind of one of the the local studios with a great Neve console that we would work at, and but the crazy thing was that the session was April 17th of '86. My wife Hope was pregnant. She was 9 months pregnant and was very excited about coming to the studio to meet George. Night before, she went into labor. And Ilse, our daughter Ilse, was born at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was in the studio with George at noon because Hope insisted that I had to go through with the session, that I couldn't not do it. And so when I was there, I got George on the phone with her, and he said, "Well, when you're ready, come and visit." So Ilse's first excursion was to Village Recorders in West LA, where we went in, and George took her out of the baby carrier and danced around with her. And when he was done, he touched her on the forehead and said something in Sanskrit. And we said, "What did you say?" And he said, "Well, I was so taken with this young life that I gave her the gift of music." And it took, because she's very successful as a songwriter and has her own album, her debut albums coming out this summer on Elektra Records in the US, but on Parlophone in the UK. So how cool is that? That my daughter's album is coming out on the Beatles record label.
I think she's written with Harry Styles as well, and it was on the Harry Styles.
Yeah, she wrote Treat People with Kindness, which I played on too.
Yeah.
I don't often play on her stuff, but that was one I did. But Shawn Mendes, Mercy, we were just in Australia, and she had a number 2 record in Australia with a German DJ named Robin Schulz, a song called Headlights. That was a big hit in Germany too, some years ago. But she's Panic at the Disco, High Hopes is one of hers. Yeah, she's really written lot of stuff for Miley Cyrus.
Did George actually pay you for those sessions, or was the teddy bear the payment?
No, I mean, I got paid. I got paid.
Was that the version of the song?
Very rarely do I do stuff that I don't get paid for, unless it's like a charity record or something.
Well, I had a story that George disappeared, and he had a load of teddy bears in his car, and he gave one to Hope to pass on to Ilse. Is that correct? Or?
Well, there was, yeah. And when we went to visit him at Village, as we were leaving, he went over to the car and he pulled out. There was a stuffed bear and a couple of other toys. We still have the bear, which is named George.
Did he bless the bear as well? Did he touch the bear on the forehead?
No, he didn't do that. No, but Ilse has in Sanskrit on her wrist. She has the gift of music written, tattooed on her wrist.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Where was that track used that you did with George? Was it used in a film soundtrack?
It was in the movie. It was in Shanghai Surprise.
It was in Shanghai, right? Okay.
Yeah, because it's different from the version that's on the Cloud 9 album.
Right. So it's pre-Jeff Lynne then. Jeff wasn't involved.
Yeah, it was Bob Rose was the producer. A guy named Bob Rose. I'm not quite sure how he got the production gig, but he did.
But Lawrence, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I'm conscious that it's getting towards lunchtime in LA. So just if anyone has any questions
I had an early lunch. But the people that have been extremely generous are my roofers, who have not been making all kinds of noise. But no, I'm happy to talk about this stuff. It's just it's good for me to be reminded also. Now I did a book. About 4 or 5 years ago, I did a book called Guitar with Wings, which has all my pictures that I took during the egg sessions. So there's a lot of fly on the wall stuff in that.
That's great. I wasn't aware of that for one.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm going to look that up.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think you'll find it on Amazon.
Can I ask you about, like, obviously, did Paul ever talk about his relationship with George and his reaction to his solo records? Like the George Harrison self-titled album from '79 came out when you were with Paul. Did he ever comment on whether he liked Blow Away as a single or anything like that?
The only time Paul didn't talk about the Beatles very much. Once in a while, he'd make reference to My Old Band. I thought it was funny. He would, if he showed up in a slightly pissy mood, it was because Yoko had done something that kind of upset him, and then he would talk about Yoko's relationship with John and stuff like that. But he didn't talk about the Beatles very much at all. I think in that period, Wings was still very much, I can do it for myself. I don't need the Beatles to be Paul McCartney kind of thing.
There was the tension between Paul and Yoko at the time, do you think?
Oh yeah, I think there was. I think that Paul still had some negative feelings there. I think over the years they seem to have reconciled, but at the time, and of course, this was before John's passing too. So, it was. But he just didn't talk about Beatles very much.
Once
in a while might have been, where we played a venue that the Beatles had played or something. He might make mention of it.
So what about when Double Fantasy came out? Would did he say anything about that, for example?
That came out what month in 1980?
November 1980.
That was November. So I didn't see him then until after John was killed. So that didn't become a really a musical topic of conversation. What I did was I took John's songs from Double Fantasy and I had Paul's demos from the Tug of War, Pipes of Peace stuff, and I did a mixtape with so I had kind of my own quasi Beatle album.
Yes, we've all done that.
Yeah.
You said that Paul did talk about John's relationship with Yoko a bit though, and around that time, what kind of thing did he?
I remember distinctly that like if they'd be at a restaurant and Yoko would be making decisions about what John would eat, and Paul just felt, I think Paul felt that she was just kind of bossing him around too much. But that's the only thing that kind of I remember from those conversations. But there was always business stuff going on, and I thought it was fascinating that when Michael Jackson bought the Beatles catalog, that people were wondering why Paul and Yoko didn't join forces to buy it themselves. But Yoko didn't need to, because in US copyright law, there's a Rear Window decision about the movie Rear Window, which stipulated that if an author dies within the first term of copyright, then there is no automatic renewal and the rights revert to the estate. And so Yoko was going to get John's share of the Beatles songs anyway, without having to lay out any money. That was really, everything was going to start reverting because it was all within what was then the term of copyright. And, I think that Paul would have liked to have, got control of that stuff. And as it is, eventually I think he's kind of managed to gain some access. But, even at the time when I joined the band, Paul was probably the largest independent music publisher in the world, because he had very large catalog. And his deal with Columbia, he got a sweetheart deal on the CBS Songs catalog, which Lee Eastman had actually put together, because Lee Eastman represented songwriters like Frank Lesser and band leaders like Tommy Dorsey and people like that, that Paul got the publishing rights to Grease, Chorus Line, and Annie, all of which got made into movies within a year. You know,
Nice.
so his, you know, from a business point of view, the Linda's family did all right for Paul.
And did Paul suggest that you recorded songs from the MPL catalogue for Standard Time? Was that Paul's instigation?
Well, that was Paul's suggestion. He was assigning, assigning albums to people. I think Zoot Money may have done one too. But yeah, I mean, that was really how that came about. But then I was having trouble getting a record deal in the UK. And then when I went over to the States, I decided I was going to release kind of a vinyl EP version of some of the tracks. And it didn't actually come out as a complete album until I did the digital release about 4 years ago. But that has Maisie on it, which was my tune that we recorded during the Back to the Egg sessions.
Yeah.
And again, was Paul
The very first fingerstyle piece that I wrote, I have Paul McCartney playing bass on. So
Brilliant.
And what prompted you to write that? Was Paul pushing you to write, or were you particularly?
No, I was realizing at that point that you didn't have to kind of sit and wait for a bolt of lightning to slap you around before you got inspiration. And so I was, when we were in Scotland and I had time like I hadn't had in years to, when, let's say, Paul would be putting down a bass part, or, some overdub would be going on, they didn't need me, I could sit outside of the cottage and just kind of play guitar, and started coming up with compositional ideas. And that was when I started writing. And
so that was your equivalent to Rishi Kesh.
What's that?
That was your equivalent to Rishi Kesh. I
guess so, yeah. But although I didn't write in great quantity at that point, but as time went on, I've now, since then, I've written about 150 guitar pieces and recorded over 30 albums and all of that.
How did you deal with the assignment, the homework assignment that you mentioned earlier, where Paul said, right, everybody go away and write a song for the B-side of this record. Good night tonight. Yeah,
I don't have the same recollection.
Okay.
My recollection of that meeting was, okay, it's January of 1979. So we're getting ready to mix Back to the Egg. Paul, we're having this meeting at around a conference table, one of those, like a board meeting. And it was agreed that we needed a single. And I remember somebody saying, well, it might have even been me. He said, what did you do in the Beatles when you needed a new single? Well, we'd write one over the weekend. So I think, I didn't even attempt to write anything over the weekend. I know Steve thinks that it was kind of like put out there as a competition. I couldn't imagine a Wings single that wasn't written by Paul. And Paul walked in on Monday morning with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering anyway, which would have blown anything else out of the water. So I have a slightly different recollection of it. But yeah, that was, I was not writing songs. I was writing instrumental stuff. So it wouldn't really have made any sense. I was not a lyricist. I tried my hand at lyric writing. My wife Hope's much better lyricist than I am.
And do you think he actually did write Daytime, Nighttime Suffering over the weekend, or do you think it's one that he had prepared earlier?
It's possible that it was brewing, but I think he definitely, he walked in on Monday morning with it, fully formed.
Yeah.
So if it was still in progress, he would have spent some time over the weekend finalizing it. This is a man with a tremendous work ethic.
So how have you kept in touch with Paul over the years, Laurence?
I'd see him when he's in town, if he's playing in town. I get messages to him one way or another. My lawyer and his lawyer speak on a daily basis on other things, so I can get a message to him, and I get emails from him periodically. So you know, there's a cordial relationship there.
And I think I'm right in saying when you ventured the possibility of a Wings reunion, you said without Linda, it's not possible, right?
That was when the Wingspan special was coming out. We talked about. I had a meeting with him, and you know, in fact, you know, I always have to say to him, you know, remember, in America, the live coming up was the hit. You know, because otherwise he'd put the studio version on there. So in the US version of Wingspan has the live version. The UK version, I think, has the McCartney II one.
Which version did Paul prefer?
Well, he liked his own one, you know, because that was him. You know, and I think that was the competition. You had Wings as rock band versus Paul as quirky, you know, electronica experimenter. And I think probably a little jealous of the fact that the live version was the one that got the accolades and not the studio version. But
do you think it has anything to do with John Lennon's comments about the Paul's version as being a nice piece of work and being the thing that one of the things that motivated them to get back into the studio again was the Paul's original version of Coming Up? Do you think that's coloured Paul's preference for
I don't necessarily buy that on the timeline. I forget when Coming Up was released. What was the release date of the studio version?
April 1980.
Right. And I mean, John was already writing the stuff that would be on Tug of War, on Double Fantasy.
Well,
yeah,
not quite, but yeah.
It reached #1 in the US in June of that year. So it was released.
June, or was it July?
June, I think, according to my notes. Yeah. End of June, the very end of June.
Yeah, because I was in New York in July and I'd walk down the street and hear it on the radio. I mean, who knows? You know what went on? I'm not party to those, you know, that stuff. But I think that, you know, for me, it was pretty exciting to be, you know, hanging out in New York and hearing myself, you know, on the street, and then walking into guitar stores and hearing people, instead of playing Stairway to Heaven, they'd be playing Coming Up.
You recently recorded with Jim Keltner, and we're all paid up members of the Jim Keltner fan club here. Did you swap stories about working with the Beatles with Jim?
Well, I've worked with Jim many times over the years. And, you know, we just talk. I mean, he was talking, this last session we did, all of a sudden he starts talking about recording, doing Jealous Guy, where it's him and John and Nicky Hopkins and what's his name?
Alan Klein.
No.
Klaus Voormann.
Klaus, yeah, with Klaus. You know, and that's pretty magical, is when Jim's talking about stuff like that. But no, we've since I first worked with him on the Donovan thing in 1986. I mean, we've done a lot of stuff over the years. You know the movie Ishtar? You ever see that movie? It was a Warren Beatty, Dustin Hoffman record movie where they played a couple of struggling, not very good songwriters that end up getting hired by the CIA to get up to some shenanigans, and it was roundly panned by the critics and was not a particularly successful movie. But Paul Williams wrote these amazing, bad but very funny songs for them to do. And when we recorded an album of the songs with Paul Williams, and I the rhythm section I put together was Jim Keltner and Abe Laboriel Sr. So that was back, I think, probably 1988 or something. I mean, you know, we've done a lot of sessions over the years, but Jim's great. But you know, it's the early 80s now. I mean, it's, you know, all these musicians are getting older. But the record that we just did was a Julian Lennon song called Saltwater Tears, or Saltwater rather.
Saltwater, yeah.
Saltwater. There's a record label in the States called Future Youth. It's a non-profit record label. And they did a competition where they got 3 female singers from around the world came to LA to record this song. And we had the band was me and Jim and Steve Porcaro on keyboards from, who was originally in Toto. And Eva Gardner, who's, remember Ashton Gardner and Dyke? Was it Kim Gardner? That's her dad. And she's a bass player that works with Pink and a lot of other kind of artists of that ilk. And we did a very nice recording of this track that I think is coming out next week for Earth Day, because it's an ecological song. And Julian was there. He didn't sing on it, but he was there for the session. So I'd never met him. Ilse, my daughter, had worked with Sean, with Miley Cyrus, where they re-recorded "Merry Christmas, War Is Over" a few years ago. But I'd not met any of the Lennon camp other than Cynthia, which I had many years ago. So
can I ask you about the
completes the circle.
Can I ask you about the Good Night Tonight video with
Sure.
the greased back hair? And obviously half of it was greased back hair and half of it was in normal clothing, filmed at Hammersmith Palais, I believe. How long did that take and what was it like? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it was one day. It was just basically kind of an afternoon into the evening. What was cool was in between takes, we had amplifiers on stage, so we were jamming. We were kind of entertaining the crew, which was very cool. Because we hadn't done a live show up to that point. We'd just been in the studio. And, it was a fun one to do. What was really fun for me was that I had worked at the Hammersmith Palais when I left college and I started gigging professionally. As I was breaking into studio work, there was Ken McIntosh band played at the Palais over the weekends. And I played guitar with them for like £4 a night or something. And it had the revolving stage so that, at the end of the set, the stage would revolve and the relief band would then show up. Well, at the end of the Good Night Tonight video, the stage revolves. And it just reminded me of my, my early days when I first started becoming a professional. So, but, things like that are fun to do. You get to, dress up a bit. And
are you doing the vocoder parts on that song?
Not on the record, but live, yeah.
Live. Okay.
Yeah, because I had a vocoder. I had a guitar rack that had a vocoder in it, and I had like a microphone that I could put on. Had the vocoder. I also had a synthesizer, a pitch to voltage converter, so that I could play like on the end of Getting Closer. I could double the guitar line with an octave lower on a synth sound too. So, as well as playing lead guitar, I was covering kind of, some of those quirky things too.
And what about the Baby's Request video? That's a very, very nice video with Denny playing piano. Tell us a bit about that.
That was on the beach. It was cold. For some reason, I remember that while I was waiting for them to set up, that Henry McCulloch, I guess, lived around there and came and said hello briefly. But, it was kind of a day where you put on a costume and you play along with the track that you've recorded. And my hair was pretty long at the time, and it was very, sea air. My hair was starting to take over the universe after a while, I think.
So do you remember whose idea it was to film all these videos and do this kind of this TV special for Back to the Egg, which was kind of a bit of a new fad for the time. How did that kind of come about?
Well, videos were, Paul had done videos, since the Beatles. That was, I mean, going back to when Tony Bramwell was putting stuff like that together. But we worked with Keith Coe. I forget Keith's last name, but the director.
Keith McMillan.
Yeah, Millen. And he was the one who did the I've Had Enough video, and then subsequently did the Good Night Tonight, and also the Egg, Back to the Egg special. And I really didn't have anything to do with any of the conception of that stuff. I just showed up and kind of assumed the position, you know.
But it's great that it's on YouTube.
Well, yeah, I mean, YouTube covers a lot of a lot of territory, you know.
I mean, we obviously want the archive released, but like, if not, then YouTube will do.
Yeah, I think I have a 3/4 inch videotape of that stuff. You know, so I have a fairly decent copy of it. But
where did they record the, you know, where they're rolling out the carpet at the beginning to show the egg? Where was that recorded?
That's a good question. I don't remember.
I think it was in London, and I think Keith and Co hired a studio somewhere.
I don't recall when we did the photo shoot for the cover. I don't recall them running video, but that might have been done then. I do remember when we did the cover shoot that the photographer was playing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the background. It's kind of like ambient inspiration. Of course, we weren't looking at the Earth. We were looking just at like an X on a, with some tape on a.
Yeah. I was also a bit disappointed by the Richard Skinner interview from 1986, where Paul is saying Back to the Egg was not one of our greatest albums, and everyone's recorded Duff albums, the Stones have, Elvis certainly has, and he was very down on Back to the Egg. And I met him outside of MPL in 1987, and I told him to stop slacking off Back to the Egg, and he apologized. But I mean, obviously that was in his mind at the time.
I guess so, but nonetheless, I mean, we played those tunes live. We were going to play them in Japan, and I think and we should probably wrap it up here, but I think that what surprises me every time I listen to Back to the Egg, which isn't very often, but I need to kind of refresh my memory on things, is that it still sounds fresh. It doesn't sound dated.
Exactly.
It has its own sonic character, which doesn't necessarily appeal to everybody, but it definitely has a character to it, and it just sounds quite real. It doesn't sound like it was kind of studio fakery or anything like that. It just but maybe I'm just not objective about it. But the fact that it has such a strong fan base and always shows up within the top 3 favorite Wings albums amongst the fans, I think Paul just needs to be reminded about that kind of thing occasionally.
Well, we love it, Laurence, and your instrumental DNA is all over it. I will say John and I listened to it in his study at school, like for a month after it came out, every day. We loved it.
Cool.
Laurence, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your generosity with us today, and
very welcome.
We'll let you get back to the roof from Back to the Egg.
There you go. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Lawrence.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laurence.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
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 Cheers.